government's dealing with big, complicated problems and lots of, the public and other people who've got agendas. So guess what? It is difficult stuff often. I mean, I myself have often been critical of government. I think it's often, you'll gather, I'm a hyper-empirical, wonk. I really want to know, does it, work? I'll just keep asking that question again and again. What's our evidence? And the truth is, governments across the world have not been very good at that. They've not been very good at actually seeing if the thing that they are already doing is working. Imagine if governments really were empirical and they said, well, what is the best way of getting someone back to work? Or what is the best way of reducing crime or reducing recidivism or anything you might want to think of, and truly applied, if you like, the scientific method to it, you'd actually start getting answers.
Welcome.
Yeah, nice to be here.
Thanks for
I was going to say, I recognise your thought on one of the things why I want to step away actually from BIT. I just not formal content, but because you get constrained by what you're commissioned to do, and then there's that stuff you're doing, and then what do you think you should be doing? And there's an overlap. It's like that fringe, which is the bits which you never quite get to, and it's really nice to have a bit of freedom. And hey, let's just do that.
Yeah, I would say I'm at the first point in my life where I can every day truly decide what I want to do. Where, like there's still commitments. I own companies. I have things I have to do, but I do them because I choose to, right? I love the football, but the podcast, I'm only going to talk to people now I want to talk to that I have an interest in, whether that's yourself or a politician or a guitarist in a rock band. It's just whoever I want. And that's a nice freedom to have.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, a wonderful freedom, truly.
And also, I think it comes with the freedom to say exactly what you want without fear, which is, I think, is also important. I mentioned to you before, an interview I've got coming up, which I won't break here. But one of the things I have noticed that I enjoy about politicians is when they stop being an MP, their interviews are much more real. I think you get a much more real conversation with them.
Yes, I think that is obviously true. And in some policy areas, it's an extreme form. Any minister who's normally been through Home Office or dealt with drugs policy, and after they leave, what do they say? It's really interesting. I think the most impressive, ministers and prime ministers I've worked with, actually, is the striking thing is their front stage and their backstage is kind of similar. So to a large extent, I think that was true for Cameron and Blair. It's actually, that is sort of who they are. And it's much less stressful, whereas you can imagine some of the other ones you think of where actually there's a very big difference and they're always managing it. And then that sort of strain comes through also with an inauthenticity sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I was on Twitter this morning looking at tweets from various Labour MPs and the Labour Party themselves, and then reading the comments.
Yeah.
And there's this very positive tweet which would explain something they've done or something they're working towards. And then every tweet underneath is people who can't stand them, criticising them. And I couldn't help but to be struck by this idea that the biggest shift, I think, one of the biggest shifts for politicians is dealing with social media. I was reading Liz Truss's book and she talks about that. And I think it's got us to a place where you have to be authentic. And one of the people I would love to interview is Kemi Badenoch. And I think what little advice as a podcaster from Bedford could offer is, if you've got any advisors telling you what to wear and what to say, get rid of them. Just go out and be in public exactly who you are and what you're thinking, because I think that's why Nigel Farage has done so well, is that you get him warts and all, and even if you disagree with him, you're like, oh, but he seems a bit real. He seems more real than the others.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Anyway, we're here to talk about the work you've done and been doing.
Yeah, in your
last few years. Just for context, of people who won't know you, and you've got your book.
Yeah.
What is your background prior to the Nudge unit?
So I did used to be a respectable academic. I started to believe at Cambridge with lifetime tenure. And I then came into government. I thought I was going to do it for 18 months to work for Tony Blair back after the 2001 election. I actually ended up working with him for 6 years until he went. Then I hooked up with Lord Sainsbury. Having spent time in government, one of the things is, oh my God, surely government could work better. And so we set up the Institute for Government. And then slightly unexpectedly, I found myself back in Downing Street in 2010 working for Cameron. So that was my background. Once upon a recovering academic, I think is the phrase that's used. Recovering academic.
Regrets?
Do I regret? No. Well, occasionally I think, oh God, So nice to sit around just doing what you want. And then comes summer and you think, oh my God, I don't have to mark a whole pile of essays for 2 weeks. And then, yeah, there are some upsides.
But the nudge unit itself,
yes,
I'd never heard of it before Joe reached out to me and said, no, it wasn't Joe. It was David Holt.
Thomas.
Yeah, no, sorry, I'm getting my names mixed up. He said you have to talk to about the nudge unit, and I was like, "What's the nudge unit?" He's like, "Well, it was part of government." I was like, "I've never heard of this. What is the background?"
Shocker. You were worrying about bitcoins.
Well, I know I'm trying to nudge people towards that.
Yeah, well, there's now lots of so-called nudge units across the world, I should say. But the origin of it was in 2010. I should say the White House were doing something quite similar. So a colleague who co-wrote the book called Nudge went in to work for Obama in the White House. But in 2010, it came to the UK in a sense. So the idea is, hey, guess what? Most policy concerns human behavior. You want people to commit less crime. You want kids to study harder in school. You want firms to adopt technology, etc. If you think about it, it's nearly always behavior. And even if you pass a law, it's because you want to generally change people's behavior. So wouldn't it be a good idea to have a sophisticated account of what drives behavior? So that was one of the ideas, one of a clutch of ideas in the wake of 2010, which was, could you create a team which really understood behavior? In the coalition agreement, there was this phrase about supporting people to make better choices for themselves. Well, how would you do that? What would that look like? And so this crazy little team was set up with no high hopes of it working, I should say. Tiny seven people, which is what would policy look like if you based it on a realistic sense of human behavior? And the idea of nudge is a particular one in the US, which is instead of telling people what to do, it turns out that relatively small prompts might make a big difference. And the famous example often used is a school canteen, right? You're going to arrange the food in one way or another. Do you come to the salad first or the chips first? It turns out it makes a big difference because you tend to fill up your plate, particularly if you're hungry, with the first things you reach. So if you put the salad first, that people might eat more healthily. But if you don't want to eat salad, no one's forcing you. You just walk on by. And so that would be what you call a nudge.
Right. Okay. So my initial thought when you say the government with policy, they're trying to affect behavior, it almost makes me then start to think about ideologically, what is the role of government? Is the role of government to nudge us towards behaviors they want us to do? Or is the role of government to deliver and service policies that we expect of them? And I feel like they're two different things.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why it's always been, there's an edge to it, which is, wait a minute, do I really want government trying to tell me affect my behavior? Bearing in mind it's doing it all the time anyway, because it's passing laws and using regulations and incentives to affect it. This is just, if you like, a subtler version of it. So there's a number of reasons why you get drawn into it. I mean, one reason governments get drawn into it, not because they want to change your behavior, but because the world actually has quite a lot of so-called behavioural predators who are trying to affect your behaviour. And so you have to think about that. So gambling would be an example, right? Gambling is using incredibly sophisticated behavioural science. I'm not saying you should ban gambling, but you have to say, well, how is it tilted? Or the way a supermarket is constructed, or going back to the school canteen, or someone had to choose, right? It can't be simultaneously the salad and the chips are right in the same place, beyond reason. So you're drawn into it whether you want to or not. And the other reason it hits, I mean, there's lots of reasons. Sometimes it's just getting rid of sludge and difficulties, why services often fail. And a way you can think about it is that it's like spraying WD-40 into the clunking mechanics of government. And that illustrates, I think, some of the, in fact, very famous, one of the most famous illustrations that will affect many people listening to this on both sides of the Atlantic is saving for pensions. We used to think there's something wrong with Anglo-Saxons, right? Why don't you save more money? What's wrong with you? And so governments have spent literally hundreds of billions of dollars using tax incentives to encourage people to save more. And they don't work very well, these things. But you may know the example. What it is to join your workplace pension scheme, which is subsidized by government and the employer, you had to fill in a form. And it turns out most people can't really be bothered to fill in a form or they mean to do it tomorrow. If you change the default, which is if you don't want to be in the pension scheme, that's fine. You opt out rather than opt in. So 9 in 10 people on both sides of the Atlantic stick with the default. And even if you ask with the people who opted out, they say, yes, good job you did it that way, because otherwise it's really boring. I had to fill in and I'm glad I'll be re-prompted later on.
I'm smiling, by the way, because my brother works for my football club and he delivered me the letter today with regards to the pensions for our football club that we have to do. So we now have to go out to each employee and ask them, would they like to opt out?
They want to opt out.
Yeah.
Right. Would you not like to have this extra money and, contribution and so on? Why it's important is that, we're still spending tens of billions on these subsidies, which do almost nothing. They're very ineffective, as opposed to changing the default, which is kind of just set it up. That's what most people want to do anyway. And you flip it around, gets 90%. So there's, within 4 to 5 years, 10 million more people in Britain were saving for pensions, right? So you can think of it as it's just, oiling the works, getting rid of the crap. Why do I have to fill in that form? Seriously? So that also counts. So it doesn't seem to impinge on your personal liberty. And in fact, if you think about a lot of everyday examples are like that. When you're driving your car, I always think a good example is a rumble strip, right, on the motorway. That slightly annoying thing if you drift off slightly and it makes that noise. Well, it's not a law. It's actually a nudge, right? It's just like it's prompting you. Wait a minute, Peter, you wake up. You're drifting. And you steer yourself straight. So it's a nudge. If you really want to drive your car into the central reservation and, trash yourself, you can do it. It's literally not stopping you do that. But it just gives you that little extra prompt and sort of guide or remind you in your behavior. So, as I said, most people don't really object to rumble strips on motorways. And essentially that's what you're trying to do. Lots of rumble strips.
And so the first time this was used was under the Blair government?
Not really, actually. No? I mean, in fact, we wrote a paper for Tony Blair, because I was working in the strategy unit, on behaviour change and personal responsibility 20 years ago now.
Okay.
It panned. It was it was like seriously a car crash, in the media, what are you doing type thing. So there was elements of it done. So the pensions example was actually introduced with Adair Turner and using some of this evidence in the Blair arena, even though in fact it didn't come into force until by the time Cameron was in government. So it was only really used in a serious way, I would say, when David Cameron and the coalition came in, and in the US with Obama. So that's when it really kicked in a more overt way.
Right, but you worked with Blair and Cameron.
I did.
Interesting.
Don't hold it against me.
No,
I was trying to do my best.
No, but that's interesting because you're working across both major parties, so there's no kind of like political ideology for you there.
No, I'm basically a policy wonk. I'm best kept in a cupboard, and you prod me and say, I've got this difficult problem. People like me, could you got some other solution? What would work? I actually spent 10 years as what's called national advisor on what works. I think, wouldn't that be a good idea for government to do things that work? So yeah, in that sense, be it on left or right, centre left and centre right, you want to try and find solutions, things that work. And then there's a world in which political parties would be less prominent. And that's what most of us would be scratching our heads thinking, gee, what's a more effective way of helping our, kids learn and our economy function better? So, there's politics that comes into that, which is appropriate. But, a lot of it is just trying to figure out what are better solutions in the world.
And so how does it work in terms of the unit itself? Is it a private company? So it's just a private company contracted? No,
it's actually gone through several iterations, which itself has kind of attracted a few interest and attention. So it started off as a very small unit in Downing Street, as I said, literally 6 and 7 people, which we didn't know if it would work. And in fact, we set it up with a sunset clause on the basis of if it didn't work, automatically we'd shut it down at 2 years. So you'd have to prove its effectiveness. It turned out it worked really, really well. And then lots of other governments and places asked us for help. And rather than just saying no, it's like, well, isn't that a really good idea? We should help. We'd learn more. So it was then very unusually turned into a social purpose company co-owned by British government. So it was a little competition for people who want to be a partner. It became Cabinet Office, employees and Nesta. And then a couple of years ago, the innovation charity Nesta bought out the other shareholders and British government. And so it now it's a company owned by a charity. That's its actual structure.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a bit weird, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a bit weird because you kind of wonder where the incentives lie when it goes from being within government to not being within government. It kind of feels in some ways that if it's outside of government, that bit of independence is better.
So I think there are pros and cons. The advantage of it being out there, as I said, it is a social purpose company and it doesn't do certain kind of work. If you came along and said, hey, look, I'm running a tobacco company, could you get more people to smoke? Then remember, I've actually just stepped away from BIT, but the answer would be, I'm sorry, we're not going to help you with that. And similarly, its charity ownership would tie it in that way. But you're right, there are some advantages of being inside government to be able to plug into policy in that extra distance. So there are pros and cons, and for mostly, it does a lot of work for British government still and elsewhere. But on the other hand, if British government thinks, hey, look, we can ask you, because it's a Bitcoin problem, go and ask you rather than, BIT. Actually, that's not bad to have some contestability and choice. But it's an interesting problem, and it's an interesting one which actually comes around pretty regularly. It's coming around at the moment, for example, about the use of AI and interesting innovative sort of applications. Which of them should be done in government, or which of them should be done outside, or sometimes somewhere in between?
Yeah, interesting. So, God, I've got so many questions. So when you are inside government doing this, you must have got some good insights into how government runs, maybe things you weren't aware of, because I feel we're at a time now where I think a lot of people are feeling like government isn't working for them. I feel like we had you don't have to opine on this, but I feel like we didn't have a very particularly good Conservative government for 14 years. And I think that's why a lot of people's votes defaulted to Labour. I think that people feel like Labour maybe aren't working for the moment. And this kind of like sense of just government isn't working. Did you get similar insights or similar sense, and maybe why that's happening?
Well, if it's any comfort, I'm not sure if it's comfort or reason for despair, but ministers and prime ministers often have the same sense on the inside. They're like, oh my God, why isn't it working? I'm trying to pull these levers and it's not happening fast enough. And of course, you can hear that right now with with Keir Starmer, with some of his frustrations coming through. So government, politics reflects, government is dealing with big, complicated problems, and lots of, the public and other people have got agendas. So guess what? It is difficult stuff often. So don't be surprised if, you it won't always happen when you click your fingers. We often used to say, in fact, when we had the strategy unit years, back in the Blair era, that people would overestimate how much government could do in the short term, but actually underestimate how much it can do in the long term, right? You can tilt and change systems and they can make quite a big difference. But yeah, you're dealing with very big, complicated systems. I myself have often been critical of government. I think it's often, you'll gather, I'm a hyper-empirical, wonk. I really want to know, does it, work? I'll just keep asking that question again and again. What's our evidence? And the truth is, governments across the world have not been very good at that. They've not been very good at actually seeing if the thing that they are already doing is working. And that's true for all of us actually in life, and not public servants. You do something and you think, well, of course I'm helping this kid. But actually, have you ever tested it? Is there a better alternative? So one of the exciting things which has started to happen, in fact, BIT was part of that story, was just importing this kind of really radical, if you like, almost brutal empiricism into government to just keep saying, does it work? Let's test it. Let's figure it out. Let's do an alternative. You don't do anything like enough of that. But if that's a half empty, the half full is, imagine if we did. Imagine if governments really were empirical and they said, well, what is the best way of getting someone back to work? Or what is the best way of reducing crime or reducing recidivism or anything you might want to think of, and truly applied, if you like, the scientific method to it, you'd actually start getting answers. And you start finding all these things you're spending money on that don't work or are actually harmful. So I'm still optimistic that if we do that, it's like the unfinished enlightenment. Why wouldn't we bring those tools of the enlightenment to government and get us out of the dark? So yeah, the frustration is there. It's partly because I said it's complex, etc. Of course, there are real disagreements, but the bit we could definitely do something about is kind of create an empirical engine in the heart of what governments do and start making progress.
So I can see why you and Thomas get on them, because having a good conversation with him and about his views on government, he was very clear that, and similar to how I think, is that I think government should run more like a business. I know, so I was talking with Connor, my son, yesterday. I have all these tabs on my browser. There's about 15 tabs, and they're all the spreadsheets that run all my businesses. I know every number that's coming in, going out, and I know the status of every company, usually within a week. And it's a very clear data set that now allows me to understand we're making money here, we're losing here, what levers do we need to pull. And I don't know how much of that happens behind the scenes with government. And if it did, I don't think they would have some of the economic policies they have. And so I don't know how much I don't think I or a lot of people really understand how much empirical data they use. And perhaps the fear is if they use empirical data, that would fear the public would fear what they hear.
It might do. I mean, I think what people are normally concerned about is using individual or personal data. And that's an interesting trade-off in its own right. To what extent you want, for example, public services to know about you, not keep asking the same dumb questions and give you a personalized service, versus how do you feel about state? And that's a really key issue. In the US particularly, you know, people especially don't trust the state, and that's their instinct to some extent here. And so that changes a bit. But nonetheless, you want your services to work, don't you? You want, you know, it to... Yeah, it would be quite nice if you're going to spend a few billion quid on the economy. Are you spending it on the right things rather than the wrong things? Or what's the best way of sort of getting people back to work? Or what's the best way of teaching kids? Or, you know, drumbeat all that. You've got 5 million public servants. Are they doing things most effective? Look, in simple terms, I think one of the examples we all kind of know and familiar with, take it for granted, is that when you go and see your doctor because you've got some ailment and they say, hey, Peter, you should take these pills. They didn't just say, oh, you know what? It's a Thursday. I'm going to give you blue ones. That's blue is good color for Thursday, right? You know, they've got some logic to what they're saying. We sort of take it for granted now that there's a big empirical world that sits behind that. But hang on, wait a minute. Now you're looking at the work of a social worker about what they're doing, or even a teacher. Like, what's the best way of teaching maths to kids who are a bit bored looking out the window? All these questions are, in fact, potentially empirical questions in the same way. And when you look behind it, you find there just isn't the same evidence base. And there's lots of telltale signs of that. And one of the clues, by the way, is the level of expenditure on R&D by governments, right? You know, if you're running a business, particularly if it's an innovative business, it's not just what you're doing now. You've got to figure out, what am I going to do tomorrow? I'm going to have to get better because my rivals will, or whatever. And so, you know, it's often discussed what's the right level, 2-3%. The big tech companies could spend far, far more than that. VW alone spends about 16 billion a year on R&D to make a car a little bit better. 16 billion, right? The entire UKRI budget, which is a big research body, for British government, is half of that. So wait a minute, we're spending a couple of trillion a year, and we're spending this little tiny smidgen to figure out what would work better, or even the things we're doing now, do they work or do they cause harm? So that's why it's at once depressing, but on the other hand, the silver lining is, well, imagine we did do it. And there has been some progress. There genuinely has been. I often think the most important thing that the Behavioural Insights team, BIT, did is it acted as a Trojan horse, if you like, of bringing very hard empirical methods into areas they've never hit before. Really simple things like, you know, if HMRC are going to send you a letter saying, I'm sure you've never had one of these. Peter, sorry, you're late paying.
Get them most weeks.
You're late paying your tax. Like, they send the same letter to everyone. Now, it might be the best letter in the world, but really, in a business, you wouldn't do that. You'd think, maybe there's a better one. You test some variations on the letter. It was an enormous battle to get HMRC more than a decade ago to allow us to vary them. It turned out if we added one line to a letter, which is for people late paying, and we'd say, you know, you're one of the few people in your area yet to pay, Peter, and, you know, most other people have already paid. This one line, it increased payment rates by 15% with no further prompt. But without a threat, just pointing out that other people are a bit more virtuous than you thought they were. So that's a big improvement, you know, on that little slide. Imagine you start doing that for everything and you start testing these variations. So in a tech world, people are very used to this idea. In government, they're not. And indeed, there are people in government who would say, well, that's wrong. We have to treat everybody exactly the same, right? That would be unfair. But if you literally do that, well, how do you find out if there's a better way? So doctors don't always treat everybody the same. When they've got a new treatment, they'll test a variation or a new drug and see if it works. That's starting to happen in other places, starting to happen in our schools. So there's something called the Education Endowment Foundation in Britain, which is a great institution, which over the last 10 years has run more than 200 large-scale experiments, experiments on our kids, but it's figuring out better ways of teaching, learning, and so on and so on. I mean, I literally think we'll look back and just think, what were we doing before? I mean, like in the same way we look back on medicine, you know, 50 or 100 years ago and just say, oh my God, they did what? They used to, you know, the expression blow smoke up someone's arse.
Yeah.
Because it was a medical treatment, right? That's what it was. If someone fell in the Thames, you blow smoke up their arse with these billows. Now we think that's pretty funny. But the reason why we know those things is someone, normally tested it and found a better variation. We're doing the equivalent of that probably in lots and lots of areas of public services, but we just never tested it, so we don't know if it's doing harm or good.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would have any issue with the HMRC letters anyway. I mean, especially if you are paying your tax and others aren't, if it would feel a bit unfair. And that to me is that almost like HMRC acting like a business. I mean, if I need to get paid by a supplier and they haven't paid, I usually phone them up because I know a phone call is more likely to lead to them paying their debts. I also know if I've got to do a sale and it's a sales pitch, I want to do it in person. I don't want to do it on Zoom. I don't want to send an email. I want to meet them in person because I know there's like a higher conversion rate, and that is treating things like a business. But I guess one of the things I'm thinking then, can there be a clash between ideology with policy and using empirical data? So if you think with regards to education, if you think in Asian countries how they teach kind of maths and English very early, but we know, say for example, within kind of left-wing governments, they want children to discover maths and they want to discover English and allow them to play and to learn. There's it's kind of that ideological approach to education, which I think has been proven to lead to worse outcomes. But ideologically, there's a position whereby they don't want to overpressure kids, and you will see, what you might get shown as the kind of what they don't want to see is these classrooms of little kids all sat there in Asian countries, diligently working. Say, no, we don't want that. We want a happier, more friendly environment. So can there be an ideological issue here?
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. But imagine if instead we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines the world's most responsible currency the right way. Because the future depends on it.
For sure there can be. I mean, it could be overtly. Literally, if you think a lot of countries teach ideology in schools. And, a soft version of that is we teach kids citizenship education because we think, you should know something. And that was something which the British were always a bit uncomfortable with, right? But we do have it now. You also get some other things. You might think back when Michael Gove was, for example, Education Secretary. He had very strong views, as often Secretaries of State do, about the right way of learning is you have to learn certain things by rote, or you should know the Magna Carta and you should know certain, or they have these kind of quite strong views. Sometimes professionals have them actually as well. They feel like this is the right way of teaching. Something called phonics, which is a big controversial thing for a while about is it right or is it wrong? Or today, long division. Should we still teach our kids? Now that could just be a matter of fact thing, but sometimes it edges into the political. But a lot of it isn't really. Is it that political? Let's suppose you decide it would be quite good for kids to learn maths, right? There's a pretty open question about what is the best way of doing that. And I'm going to give you a concrete example actually from Asia, interestingly. There's a famous program called the Singapore Maths Mastery Program, which is a way of learning maths. Now, Singapore does really well on a lot of these sort of educational attainment things. The UK Educational Endowment Foundation thought it's pretty interesting. They ran then a controlled trial on the Singapore Maths Mastery Program in British schools. It's basically a way you should learn 3 different ways of looking at numbers or a problem, and then, turns out it is better than the normal way we teach maths, and actually kids seem to find it fun too. So it's like, make that ideological. It doesn't feel very ideological, right? It's just like, so of course there'll be points. And there's certainly points where we would develop what we thought were quite interesting interventions. And sometimes ministers will say, no, I don't think we should do that. And that's entirely appropriate. Now you can ask me for one, aren't you?
Yeah, of course. Of course, I want to hear one.
That'll into that. Okay, we just are talking about tax, right?
Yeah.
One of the things, where people, if you're late paying your tax, we fine you. Well, HMRC does, right?
Yep.
And they start being mean to you. What happens if you pay them early? Right? Nothing.
Okay.
It's like, Well, that doesn't seem right. Why don't we encourage people to, if you pay early, it'll be a good thing, right? There's another reason why you want to do it historically, which is that everybody, guess what, pays their tax at the last minute, and then the system crashes. So they have an actual reason, lots of reasons why. Well, hang on, why don't we do something? If you pay your tax early, if we fine you when you're late, why don't we give you a little something if you pay it early? So we suggested this to ministers. It was based on an intervention done actually in Sweden with speeding, where they took the speeding fines. They would also take pictures of cameras of cars driving well, and every month there'd be a lottery. If you're driving well, you might win this prize. So you had a positive incentive too. So well, why don't we put people who are paying early into a lottery using some of the fines, which we thought would be quite nice, wouldn't it? Anyway, ministers it's pretty clever, but they didn't want to do it. They just thought it was wrong. They had a particular reason, which you might call a political one, which is a lot of people who would do their taxes longhand like you would have to is probably because you've other earnings and so on, or whereas a lot of employees wouldn't do that in Britain. And so they were like, does it look like we're giving prizes to wealthier people who are doing their taxes and not? So you can see what I mean?
Yeah.
So, but partly our job is to kind of come up with things that might work, ideally test them. And then it's entirely appropriate when it hits the political to say, well, no, we think that's wrong for some reason, and they're the ones who are elected. They should make the decision. So the role of a good creative civil or public service should be to generate these good ideas, but there should be someone else who you've elected who sat there to say, no, I don't think so. I don't think so, David, really, not that one.
Can I tell you a really interesting paying my tax late story?
Go on.
So with one of my businesses, I keep all the profits in Bitcoin. I've mentioned this to you before,
right.
That I had the Bitcoin podcast. And so at any time where I have to pay my tax, I have to sell the Bitcoin to pay the tax. And the tax bill was about, let's say, I'm going to pick some numbers out there because I can't remember exactly. Say it's about £200,000. Yeah. And the price of Bitcoin at the time, it was about 8.5 Bitcoin to pay the tax bill. So I phoned up my accountant and said, what will happen if I don't pay it now? She said, well, you'll get fined. And I said, what? How much? She said, it'll be you'll pay a certain amount of interest. And so over the period, right up until I paid it, the interest was about £8,000. But my tax bill, priced in Bitcoin, kept coming down because the price of Bitcoin had been going up.
Yeah.
And so by the end of it, I think I saved around 4.5 Bitcoin by paying my tax late.
Right.
I treated it like a low interest loan from the government to buy Bitcoin. And anyway, it got to the point where I got a letter saying, you have to pay.
Right.
And I phoned up my accountant. I said, well, what happens if I don't pay this? Well, she said they'll send you another letter. And so I pushed it right to the very limit, but I ended up making money off the government doing that. So that was my little win.
Presumably it has to have a little footnote for any listeners, like it may go up or down with respect to your tax bill.
Yeah, this is a high-risk asset.
Yeah.
But I think with a lot of these things, I don't know, I think, like I say, with some of these things, don't think I would mind. I think if it was something like, if people were a good driver on the cameras when it's a lottery, that starts to feel a little dystopian, a little bit like we're being tracked to see if we're good citizens. It feels a little bit like a social credit score.
Right, which is
the end game of this, whereby if you talk about HMRC letters, I mean, I don't care. I think that's a good thing. That's a business decision. But if it starts to be tracked, if you're a good citizen, where do we end up here? Do we end up with the Chinese social credit score? And what can stop, because the road to hell is paved in good intentions. What stops this becoming dystopian?
So it's a really good question, and often, those are the appropriate concerns people have. And the Chinese, sesame system is, in some ways looks like a big behavioural system. It's what some systems do in prisons, right? You have a behavioural system and tokens for good and bad behaviour, and you shape behaviour. Hey, you might do that with your kids. By the way, it's a bad idea for your kids. I should just, in case you're wondering. So just smile and be nice. Don't use tokens.
Sorry, Con.
Sorry. Yeah. But look, that is a potential arc of it, which is why these things need to, they need to hit a democratic or some, who decides? Let me put it that way. So I think a really key question one should always ask is, well, who shapes the shapers? Who aren't only government. Really important question. So whether you like it or not, a lot of these behavioral effects are what's sometimes called choice architecture. The way the world is constructed around you does affect what you do, and it's sometimes surprisingly powerful. Like, when you go into a supermarket, people are more likely to buy the things on the end of the aisles. They are more likely to buy the things by the checkouts. And if you have sweets, then your kids are there pulling on, So the question is who decides. And there is an interesting subtle difference of view, I think, I myself have with some of my US colleagues on this, which is this whole approach was sometimes known as, it was originally called libertarian paternalism, if that's not too terrible a phrase. In fact, that was the working title for the book Nudge, before a publisher said, you got to be kidding. And the idea is that, it's paternalistic because it's trying to guide you towards healthier eating, exercise more, whatever it would be. But it's libertarian in the sense that it's not enforcing, and it, unlike your tax bill, actually nothing very much will happen. But the thing is, if it's still powerful, is that enough? Because someone is still deciding that choice architecture, which is affecting you, and it's not you. And it could be government, but it could be a business, and so on. And so to me, one of the reasons it comes back is that, be it a minister or in some other form, you have to say who shapes the shapers. And that's really, really matters. I'll give you an example which we did recently, which I think was really important. So something which we're all living in, which is in social media. Well, who sets the rules on social media, right? So should it be, for Zuckerman to do it, or should it be for British government to do it, or whatever? And our question is, well, why can't the users? What would it look like? And so we did this thing with Meta across quite a number of countries, I think 30 odd countries, more than 20 languages, where we asked groups of people who are users saying, well, how would you set the rules about disinformation? What would you do? And they would have time together. It's not like a quick thing, it's like spending a couple of days. Or look, in a world, we're going to meet AIs more and more. Do you want the AI, like you're going to tell it all kinds of things? Do you want it to remember, or do you want it to forget? That's actually really quite a subtle question. Do you want it to be so stupid you meet it again, it's like, oh my God, it's really annoying. It's just that, I had this conversation yesterday. On the other hand, you just told it your deep, dark secrets, like a kind of barman. Do you want it to remember or not? Who do you want it to tell? So who sets these kind of rules or the choice architecture? And so I think one of the ways of saying it's not just that the Americans often would say it should be choice enhancing. It shouldn't remove a choice. Like the pensions stuff is that if you don't want to be in the scheme, you can just say no on the letter. So it doesn't take away the choice. But a stronger form is, well, who set the architecture? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so in the end, I think one of the useful things that behavioral science does is that it helps us all understand these forces that affect our behavior so that you can take back control, to use a phrase, either individually say, oh, you know what, I see what's happening here, I don't want it to happen. Or collectively you say, actually, I don't want sweets by the checkout all the time. Can we not have them anymore, guys? Which of course is a change which has happened. You see what I mean? So I think you have to join the loop back up. And it's not unique to behavioral science. In fact, it's what we want governments to do in general. And sometimes there's the narrow corridor, this thing where if you're going to give more powers to government or a business or anything else, at the same time, you want to say, have we also enhanced the ability of citizens to constrain it? You see what I mean? They go hand in hand, ideally.
Yeah, I think some of it comes down to the difference between what is private business, what is government. It reminds me of a conversation the other day I had with my son. He was asking me about, we moderate the comments on our YouTube because there's so much spam. But he started saying, what do you get rid of? I said, hardly anything. I get rid of the spam, and there's certain highly offensive things that I'll remove, and that's it. And he said, is that not censorship? And I said, no, because I'm a private business. Right. So as a private business, I can't censor. Censorship is something that government does and that we ought to stop. And so when Sainsbury's chooses to put sweets by the aisle, I can choose to go to Waitrose or a farm shop. I have all those other choices. When it comes down to government, my only other choice is another vote, perhaps in 4 to 5 years, yet the same nudge unit might still be working within it. There is a slight difference. And I guess it makes me think, with this unit, how does it work well, actually a wider point, because you said who governs the rule makers? It wasn't your exact term.
Well, who shapes the shapers?
Who shapes the shapers? It's this, because we have this ballooning civil service in the UK at the moment. It's very different from the US. Donald Trump on 6th of January will come into power and he will decide his Fed chairman and head of the SEC and such, the head of all these different bodies. And they get to essentially follow the policies which his administration sets. Whereas in the UK, we don't really have the same. We have this kind of large civil service which is unelected and sits outside of it. And so I think I would probably have a preference for more the US model, because then something like the nudge unit, if the nudge unit, say, had become, say, ideological one way or the other, it doesn't really matter. But let's say it was ideologically conservative and we now have a Labour Party in, would it work against the best interests of the current Labour Party without them even knowing, trying to influence in a way that was against the policies or the mandate that Labour government had been given?
The deep state.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just one tiny constitutional point just to clarify, by the way, which is civil servants, people are often confused about this, aren't public servants. They serve the government of the day. So if you're recruited into the civil service, you should get asked questions about, would you serve any government, basically? And if you give an indication that you wouldn't, you probably shouldn't be a civil servant, right? Literally, you get selected out on that basis. But it's an important detail. So they actually aren't public servants. They are civil servants, which means they serve the elected government of the day. So the formal position should be, they should not be a state inside a state. They're not supposed to be that. And you have various things. You can say, are they strong enough? The bit which I think is more tricky is that for all of us, including civil servants, I'm not a civil servant, of course, anymore, not for a long time, but you can slip into sort of tacit, they're not big P political assumptions, but you get other kinds of ways of, you're kind of caught in a way of thinking, almost paradigmatically, you would say. And then that actually often is quite a big drag in the system, which you often see when you get changes of government in a number of places, across the world. You're right, the US system has massive number of presidential appointments, nearly 10,000. In fact, they very rarely complete them because there's so many of them. And in the British system, there's very, very few of those political appointments. But you can build up these kind of assumptions as you can in public services and so on. I'll give you one if you want to be a little bit edgy about this.
Let's be edgy.
You asked me the last 14 years. This is edgy for a policy one. You see if it's but there were a lot of assumptions about how markets work in British government, I think, and in lots of places. And there's often a kind of alignment between, if you like, an overt political view, which is, I'm going to caricature it a little bit, not much, which is the best thing government should do is just get out of the way of markets. You should be able to do your business. You were talking about it earlier. Businesses will compete with each other. They'll figure out if there's a better solution and so on. The wonders of
the free market.
Right, exactly, the free market. And, anyway, yes, so the free market. And that's, definitely true to a significant point. But there are lots of what are called market failures where it doesn't work. So in your example, you can go to another supermarket, but, you might do, but you might not. What often happens is you get locked into a kind of equilibrium where they all find that, geez, it's so profitable to put the sweets on the checkout that even if the parents don't particularly like it, they all end up doing it, And so you get locked into an equilibrium. And there are loads of those sorts of failures, and some of them are more subtle. And I would say that there was a bit of an alignment between, essentially, if you like, a political view, which is a more pro-market, overtly pro-market, which you saw in the last 14 years, with a tacit view in a lot of the civil service, including the Treasury, which is kind of the best thing you can do is get out of the way and let the market solve things. Like that would be the starting point. And that, almost from an empirical point of view, turns out to be wrong in many areas. So a simple example would be, I think pretty much every single other OECD country, except Britain, now has something akin to what's called a productivity council, a body normally somewhat independent, which is trying to figure out, what are the things you do to help businesses be more productive? And what does government do and so on and so on.
Get government out of the way.
Well, sometimes but it's not only that, right? You still want roads or you want, there are lots of obvious public goods, but there can be other ones too that get in the way. Not least, clunky bureaucracy, you might say, but, there are lots of things and more subtle market failures. So that's, you've got a kind of coming together of a small p set of instincts with some political ones. And if I'm going to push this a bit further, because I can see you're a bit skeptical on this, but I'm going to try and run an argument, which is something I certainly felt frustrated about in recent years, which is there are these subtle kind of market failures. And one of the great puzzles in an economy is why there's often this so-called long tail of low productivity, which is, in other words, in any given area, you can normally find there are lots of companies which don't seem very good at what they do, right? Mm-hmm. So some widget maker doing that, sometimes the lifestyle company, whatever, but if the market's really working efficiently, they shouldn't really be there, or they should disappear quite fast, and they don't, right? So I don't know, I'll give you a concrete example. I know I need to get some new windows from an old house, right? And my choice is either go and spend a lot of money on a joiner, or I can go to kind of use a Travis Perkins, whatever, an outlet, and I can buy one, but they're only certain sizes. Well, why can't someone make me a bespoke one really fast? Now, a couple of companies that do that, right? And they can give me the window, the size I want, really fast, and the same price as I get it in the wholesaler. So why wouldn't I do that? Why is there so many joiners still making windows? And it's basically because in many areas, it's quite hard to find what's a better product. Or you think about lawyers or traders or whatever. There are some systems there, and it's TripAdvisor and so on. They often don't work very well to distinguish between the good and the bad. And the economy will eventually, you could say, resolve it, but it doesn't do it very efficiently. But if you believe in so-called the efficient market hypothesis, and it works perfectly, you definitely want to touch that. But if you think, actually, your new business might not succeed because the market doesn't do a very good job of sorting out, is it better than some alternative? So that becomes an area where you think, well, I don't want to pick winners, but actually we all have an interest in making the market work more efficiently. See what I mean? So I think there are areas that are like that, which do get sort of blocked off because people get stuck in a rut intellectually, including about how do you make markets work more efficiently. So it's to some extent the echo of what we were talking about earlier. In public services, is this just what's the best way of teaching kids? What's the, efficiency? In the public services, you often don't have the competition of the market to drive it. And so you get kind of stuck. But even in the market, there are lots of areas where that doesn't work very well. And so rather than having lots more regulation, you can say, can we make the market work better? So if you come up with a crappy financial product, you'd hope that the market would very rapidly get rid of it. But it often does it very inefficiently and very slowly. So I don't know, you think on pensions, the level of charges historically on pensions were often very oddly high. People, it's good service, but you look at it, empirically it wasn't true. But, I'll pay 2% or whatever, like a mad amount. The market didn't seem to solve that problem. People didn't seem to be able to distinguish between what it's worth to pay extra to someone manage your pension, right? That would be a simple everyday example. Anyway, I'm rambling on about this.
No, saying, but I don't understand there with your example with the windows. What is wrong with that long tail of small joiners who, with low productivity, small businesses?
Well, you say, fine, if everybody wants to buy it and there's, you want to spend the extra 3 times more on a window, but it's that you get often this kind of, it's a slowness of technology adoption or whatever. Is there a better alternative? And the market is pretty inefficient, often not identifying it. You just think about your everyday life. You need some building work done and you want to get a good builder. How do you do it? You often go and ask your friends or a recommendation. That's not bad, but it's not perfect, right? It's actually highly imperfect. There's a classic old example around even pre-Google, right? Which is if you open the old yellow pages or whatever, still lots of examples of it, and you're trying to find a plumber, and you'll see a whole load of which are AAA plumbers, right? Or aardvark plumbers, right? And why they do it? Because they want to get to the top of the list. It turns out those plumbers called that are systematically worse and more expensive. So what's going on? Why does the market just get rid of them? Well, why? It's because, oh my God, I've got a leak. Your husband, your wife is shouting at you. Get it fixed, Peter. You go to the yellow page, or now you Google how many people go past how many pages, and you got your adverts at the top.
Well, technology has solved that, though.
It's helping, but it's absolute. But all I'm just saying is that you get these kinds of inefficiencies. Maybe I'm spending too long on this example, but
no, it's interesting.
It's that I was trying to illustrate. I think it becomes sometimes almost quasi-ideological that markets will clear in some areas, where sometimes they don't. It doesn't mean that the state has to take over those markets, but you can say, geez, what can we do if we can help people, the intermediaries, you nurture them into place to make better choices, it improves market functioning in lots of ways, and you can reduce regulation and, so.
My father became an aircraft engineer because when he joined the RAF and they had the listed careers, the first one was airframe. Yeah, it's airframe engineer.
Right.
That's the first one on the list, so we took it. It's
right.
Like the AAA plumbers.
It is true in many areas. University rankings, lots of things are done, and by default, again, it's like the canteen. You're going to have it in some order. So, generally speaking, institutions which are earlier in the alphabet often have a marginal advantage because you're trying to find where to go to university. It's like, oh, Cambridge, Aberdeen. It's like, do you get to the other end of the list? And that's still true. I can give a real example. When we were looking at stuff about, when Brexit occurred, lots of firms suddenly finally got a lot more bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. You may have noticed. You've got to do all these forms. And so suddenly export advisors become really important, right? Particularly for small firms. Because, oh my God, do you want to do all this bureaucracy? No. Can I get someone to do it? So HM government, helpfully, somebody had the thoughtful thing, well, why don't we put a list of export advisors? It turns out there's nearly 1,000 or so of them. Guess what? How is that list constructed?
Alphabetical.
It's alphabetical. I kid you not. It's an alphabetical list of 1,000 firms.
So Aaron does very well.
Guess what? Literally, firms start changing their names, or they even realize, you know what, it's not just letters. If you put a character in the front, you get bumped to the top of this list. So your competition is now being driven by how do I get to the top of this list, not by some measure of quality. There's some poor sod who calls their firm Zebra Advisors. Bad idea. Anyway, I'm just saying it's a silly example, but it's a real example, which is that is not how you want your market to function, driven by the ranking and the alphabet. You want it to be able to be sorted by some other measure with something called deshrouding. You want to be able to see the other attributes, quality, etc. It's really important for market functioning. And one of the things, you either want market players to step into it, but if they don't, a sophisticated government, in my view, is interested in making sure the market works well. It should really be that your company, if it's better than others, it shouldn't be choosing for people, and we should have a common interest in helping people make better choices.
It's very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
Yeah, I can see the argument, but then I go to the net impact of government and think, well, so for example, the Labour Party at the moment want to change employment laws so people have full protection from day one. Me as somebody who recruits people across my businesses thinks this is a terrible idea because you don't know what somebody's like till you've worked with them for a few months.
Right, let's come back to that.
But I quite like the US model that as long as you're not being discriminatory, you can sack anybody at any point. I think that creates a more efficient market. I think what employment laws outside of overt discrimination have done is they have allowed people to weaponize the law against employers, and they've created this inefficient bureaucratic process where you're trying to remove people from your business. I had an advertising agency years ago, going back a decade. We lost our biggest clients, 40% of our business.
Yeah.
We had to let 40% of our staff go. We spent a huge amount of money bringing in HR people to go through the consultation process, where we got to the end result anyway, because what happens is you design the process to get to the end result, just trying to make sure you don't slip up and get sued. But so that added inefficiency into the process. It created new work for HR consultants, but it didn't change the outcome that we needed 40% of the staff to go and the business would have failed. And I can give you so many examples of that across all my businesses, all these inefficiencies that come in from government.
So, look, there's various things going on. And by the way, of course, it's been a recurrent argument in government. It was a very big one, for example, in the coalition between the two partners, the Lib Dems and the Tories, about what to do on that issue. With the conservative view tends to be let's lower the barriers and so on. Again, let the market work. Versus, do you create a stronger floor and a backstop position? You have some floor. You're not saying there's none, but what's the right level? But let me just use that as a great example. So I think there's a third way that you would do it.
Okay.
So I'm not advising the PM right now, but if I was doing on this, or Liz Kendall, I would say. You said you can't tell until after you join. That's really interesting to unpack, because that is very much true, right? It's a very big choice who you work for. It turns out you often can't even find out what you'll pay. You see an advert and then only afterwards do you find out what you're going to pay and you start negotiating, right? Or what will be the pay progression? You might want to know that. That'd be a pretty good thing to know. Should I join your firm or someone else? I might want to know how many people exit, or even would be really good if I'm choosing a university, I can find out how much it costs, how much are the future earnings. So it might be, Peter, I should come and work for you. You don't pay very well, but it turns out working for you for 18 months, people who do that go on and make a fortune, right? Wouldn't it be neat to know all that? Oh, that would be fantastic. Because then you would, what we call, you're deshrouding, you're revealing the choice better. Oh, is that a fantasy? Oh no, it's not a fantasy. It could absolutely be done. It could be done really soon. I think you could aggregate, you've got your national insurance number, right? For most firms, you can reassemble it back to the firm level. Wait a minute, who that data actually exists? Literally, government has it in HMRC and DWP data. So you could aggregate it and make it available on job platforms where you could see well, what is the average earnings? What is the wage progression? What is the exit rate? How much do you know what I mean? Now you've got a better informed labour market. And because Glassdoor gives you a glimpse into that, right? It's not perfect. But a really interesting question is, what does a really good version of Glassdoor look like? You really want to know, are you about to work for David Brent, or is this person a wonderful manager? I mean, it's a really important choice, not just for your earnings, but your life satisfaction. And you don't know it till afterwards, right? See, in a well-functioning market, and I think on left and right, you could agree and say, well, wouldn't it be good to have more of that information available? So if you are, Peter, you're a fantastic employer, right? Literally, everybody should want to come work for you, right? Maybe you can, in fact, pay marginally less because you're such a wonderful person to work for and you'll learn all these things. Whereas someone else down the road who's really a horrible person or employer, they should have to pay a premium in a well-functioning market. And what I'd say is those premiums aren't right because the information isn't flowing. So the alternative between have more and more employment law or just take it all away is, no, let's really lean into informing people. So if you think about the old BIT phrase in the coalition was support people to make better choices for themselves. Like, how would you really do that? And then you realize, actually, there's lots of possibilities which aren't being pursued. And they also get blocked off if you just think the market will clear it itself. Because sometimes it will, sometimes it won't.
Are you aware of a website that existed about 8 years ago called the Silk Road? Yeah. I tell you, so I know a lot about this website because I know the mother of the man, Ross Ulbricht, who was sentenced to a double life sentence, was 40 years for operating the website. Yeah. And I've interviewed her and I've spoken to various journalists who've written about it. I also looked into what the Drug Policy Alliance said. It was a really interesting thing that the website did. Historically, if you buy drugs, go to Tesco's and you meet somebody, you wait 15 minutes or an hour and you get whatever drug you want, you go home and you don't know what you're getting. Yeah. What the Silk Road did is they had a review system. So anyone buying could review the sellers. And what happened was it forced the sellers to provide a better product with less impurities, a cleaner product, so less danger. And it changed the trade from an unreliable when somebody will turn up to a package delivery to your door. It reduced crime and it reduced deaths with the consumption of drugs in a market where prohibition hasn't worked. And I understand why the government closed it down. I totally understand that, because in what world does a government these days say, no, this is fine? But it was fascinating to see that somebody through a website and technology had changed a market from a dangerous, violent market with high risk for the consumption to something that was not no risk, but lower risk and remove violence.
So I think it's very interesting. And of course, I've not studied it in detail that you have, but it's an example of where actually a market solves the trust problem. I mean, more everyday example would be eBay or something, that you're able to trust someone selling something from their window, from their bedroom, or whatever, and that's really powerful. Trust is incredibly powerful to make markets work. So there's some areas, and you want to learn those lessons elsewhere. So look, there are other familiar ones. If you're going to go to a restaurant, this has been particularly well studied. You look at the ratings, and particularly if you're in an unfamiliar environment, so you move backwards and forwards in the US, you go to some, and we know they change the market dynamic. So in, for example, US data, having an extra star on a 5-star rating means that restaurant grows at between 7 to 9% faster the year following. It's a causal effect. It's beautiful, right? Interestingly, we also know that it drives the growth more strongly on the positive end than it does. It's sort of half the effect squeezing on the bad end. So what it means is the market literally gets bigger because, like your Silk Road example, you become able to take a choice in going to this restaurant because you kind of know, actually, I'm probably going to be okay. So that is a really good example of it working, right? And we see it if you're going to go and get a hotel for your holiday. Now think of all the areas where it doesn't exist, right? If it works so well then, and it really does, it changed the market dynamic, why not elsewhere? What about choosing a care home? A care home's really important. Saying you've got really good rating systems to figure out where to go and stay on your holiday, but where to leave your mother, there isn't. Like, what is that about, right? By the way, that's a blended private market with often state purchasing. So there are loads of areas like this. So You can say, well, is that, hopefully you're, and social innovators listening to this will say, okay, we're going to go and fix this for a whole load of other markets. That's great. So if that happens, great. It hasn't happened for a lot of markets so far. But I'm saying even if it didn't, governments, and we collectively, forget government, we collectively have an interest in having that solved, right?
Yeah.
So that's a really, really big deal and quite an exciting area, be it on labour market or a whole load of other fronts. And if you did that, so our back of the envelope, just worth it.
Yeah.
We did an estimate a couple of years ago. We think you could roughly double the UK's productivity growth rate if just for areas of the market you could apply TripAdvisor type things, you did so.
So it makes me think of another area. No, I think you'll like this one, the dating market.
Ah.
Up until recently, I'd been single for quite a long time. Had used the dating apps.
Right.
And have single female friends. And the dating apps have completely changed the dating game. Historically, it was mainly a man who would go up to a woman in a public place and ask her out, trembling with fear. If by some chance she wanted to take your phone number, you'd maybe court her and go on a few dates. And if she wanted to date, you'd stick with it. But women had control of the dating market, essentially, because they were the yes or no.
Yeah.
What the dating apps did, they took out the risk because it was a swipe. You just keep swiping, every now and again get a ping and you got a match. And so they gave, it put men in control of a situation they weren't in control before. And it's changed the dynamics quite significantly in that a lot of men now, they date multiple women at the same time and they don't really care about commitment. And so what I noticed when I was dating, especially as in my kind of mid to late 30s, you'd go on dates very early on, the women would say to you, look, I just want to know, would you have more kids and do you want to get married again? They just want to know, because for men, you can still give children up into your 70s. For a woman, there's a ticking clock here. And we have a low birth rate issue, and we also have a trust issue in the market with these girls. And also, they can date a guy for a month, 2 months, and then suddenly find out he's dating other people. The way the market, funny enough, has solved it, there is a Facebook page, I think it is, which is something like, am I dating your boyfriend? And you can go on there and you can search for a name and you can find out girls if they're, so this girls have now clubbed together to find out if guys are basically dating multiple women at the same time.
Right.
But we have a low birth rate at the moment. We have a lowering marriage rate, a higher divorce rate, and population growth is, we know that's an issue. A falling population puts so much demands of us, future generations, on the generations are getting older. That hasn't been solved. That is a problem. We've handed the keys to the men, and we are kind of donkeys, and so that is something that could be solved.
It is. God, you're pushing. Do you want the government doing that? I mean,
no, I don't want the government doing that.
Some governments, Singapore, for example, actually does. There are some countries in the world, and of course, it's using incentives, by the way, to change that behaviour, to encourage people to have more kids or get married earlier. I think in general, in Britain, we've not done that. But look, you probably don't want government anywhere near that. But what it does illustrate is that it's a problem which is a collective problem. And, in fact, sometimes it's called the marriage market. How do you improve its efficiency? That's a really interesting area for many things that we do in life. Can you solve the trust problem, right? I'm just saying, like, I know we've kind of moved on a bit, but that there are a lot, you'd make a lot of civil servants' brains explode by this conversation about what the government might or might not be. But there are some interesting levers and possibilities, certainly around improving market functioning and around trust in general. And for what it's worth, one of the key drivers of economic growth is social trust. It's just literally this old question we've asked for a long time. Do you think other people can be trusted? Yes or no, can't be too careful. That's the two answer questions. And will you say that? Would you say, generally speaking, other people be trusted?
Depends who they are. But again, this is, I didn't even think this would come up, but this is why Bitcoin is an interesting technology, because it's trustless. Do I trust government with being the issuer of money? Governments historically have happily increased the money supply. We've had bad periods of inflation. Inflation affects the poorest in society the worst. It devalues our money. Wage inflation hasn't kept up with real world inflation. But what can you do? Because government is the issue of money. Most people aren't going to buy gold or barrels of oil and keep them in the garden. And that's what Bitcoin did. I can send money to you and you to me trustlessly, and there's no issue of money. So that might be one the government wouldn't like, but it solves a problem with government.
Yeah. But I'm not. You spend a lot more time on this than I have. But it at least illustrates the point, which actually these trust dynamics are. And as you know, historically, sometimes financial systems have collapsed because if the trust goes for various kinds of reasons. But I'm just saying it's a more widespread issue with respect to trust. That actually markets, when they function well, are able to solve that problem. But they often require a bit of help to do so in order to create a kind of, be it your gold standard in money or whatever it would be. And that's true in other domains. So one of the reasons why you want sometimes regulation is, particularly for infrequent purchases, what is the backstop position which will sanction or squeeze out? But in a better world, you get the market to do it better itself. That's what I'm just saying. So I actually think that's quite a rich area in between, where some version of sometimes of social entrepreneurs and sometimes with help of government, whatever, interesting combination. How do you make markets genuinely work better so that you can trust them? Bearing in mind, like we've got a huge amount of fraud, for example. And how do we solve that problem? You can see it's incredibly toxic if it starts to get into your economy. But this is part of the the behavioural story which we're all wrestling with, not just the micro end of it, but the macro end. In fact, fraud would be a good example where how do you know if it's true or not? How do you get this thing and well, can I not trust anything anymore every time I get asked to make a payment? That's a really big problem which we should be worried about, which has strong behavioural components, given that the human being is often the weak link now, right?
I know my answer to this, but would you say we're becoming a more trusting or less trusting society?
It's very interesting. And so, of course, it depends what you ask about. So trust in government often has gone down in a number of countries. That is true.
I agree.
One of the most important things, sometimes trust in business is okay. It varies, but often good.
I'm thinking also media.
Well, media is a really, can you trust what you're reading, and do you know, really does matter. If you're going to, in wonk world, if you try and put it together, one of the key variables that looks like matters is just that simple question. Generally speaking, do you think other people can be trusted? That massively varies across the world. So there are lots of countries within which less than 10% of people would say yes to that question. There are countries where 60 or 70% would say yes. There are big differences in our population. So people who are more affluent and middle class are circa twice as likely to say yes, whereas people often living in, more deprived kind of conditions say, no, you can't trust other people. It's really consequential. So if you want to predict, for example, the economic growth rate of a country, that single question is a better predictor of future growth rate than level of human capital, skills. So it's really important. Do you live in a world where you think you can trust people? And if you think, well, why does that matter? Is that, you imagine in your business context, if you think you're doing someone you can trust, you can do it on a handshake, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't, you got to have insurance, you got to have lawyers. If you're living in a world where you don't trust other people, who you can employ as your employee, you employ your cousin or someone you know. If you're in a world where you think you can trust other people, you employ the best person for the job, or how information flows, incredibly consequential.
So lack of trust is an inefficiency.
You can call it an inefficiency, but it's very, very consequential. Yes, absolutely. It creates all kinds of costs. And indeed, one of the arguments why firms exist, there's an old classic work about why do companies exist? And the argument is because you create a bubble of trust. So your employees, I don't know how many employees you've got, but you'd say, they don't have to take a contract each time they do something. They just, oh, fine, Peter, can you help? Yeah, I'll do this backwards and forwards. So so-called in technical terms, it lowers transaction costs. So when you're in a high trust environment, it means you can do things much, much more efficiently. So it's interesting between the world of business and indeed all our lives and indeed government, we have a collective interest in trying to create a world which is not just high trust, but trustworthy. Right? Actually, that's the thing that really lies behind it.
Well, but companies exist because we're forced by government to register as a company if we want to do business. If we went back hundreds of years, people would do business, but they wouldn't have a registered company.
No, sorry, I don't think you're saying it's a good or a bad thing, but yes, one of the arguments would be, can you?
I don't think I'm picking either way. Actually, it's just more of an observation that.
Yeah. It's just sometimes governments can solve it. Sometimes non-government entities historically have solved it. There's a very famous one in Britain, which is Lloyd's. Lloyd's in terms of shipping. And in London, when you had these coffee houses in the 1750s, 60s and 40s, like you're gonna put all your stuff on your whole fortune because you're gonna put stuff on the ship. Like, will it sink? Because it's really important, right? Will it get there? Will it disappear on the way? And so actually ledgers were created and so on, ways of tracking who can you trust and who can you not, including will this sink? Is it seaworthy? And that led to, as a non-government solution, Lloyd's register, which is a register of ships. So someone see how it was built, and then if it's a good one, it's built right, they put this thing on the ship and you can see it. It's a really elegant way of increasing trust, right, in a market. So there's lots of ways of doing it, but it's really important. I think what sometimes happens is that we almost can't see the wood for the trees of what actually makes economies and markets and societies work.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things, if you kind of pull back the curtain on that, that gives both opportunities for good social entrepreneurs. By the way, it can also create opportunities for bad actors to, feign, but it also sometimes is a role for government to fix it for all of us.
At Ledden, we built the best Bitcoin-backed loan platform in the world. Proven, trusted, growing. Ledden's proven track record speaks for itself. Visit ledden.io/Mr. Obnoxious to get started. Ledden, there is no second best. Ledden is not regulated in the United Kingdom. Any credit products or virtual asset services provided by Ledden are not subject to UK regulatory protections. Please consider the risks associated with virtual assets and consult a financial advisor before making any decisions.
Yeah, so when you were within government doing this work, how much of the work would be, say, a minister coming to you and saying to you, we want to look at this, versus you having your own kind of ideas and thesis that you developed that you could work on? Because government is so big. You talked about 7 people. Where do you even start?
Yeah, well, the team did grow, of course, over time, and now it's done work for many governments across the world, but it was always a mixture. So often, there are big issues running through government about what we can do on this or that or the other. Like, this austerity had a big gap in the budget, so it's pretty helpful if people would pay their tax. So, hey, that would be a good thing to do. So that'd be an example. Sometimes we would proactively go after issues which we thought were really important, and often because we didn't win the argument either. Like people would say, So an early controversy we were involved in, which you might say continues to this day, was in the early days of the Behavioural Insights team, vapes were appearing, e-cigarettes, and the British government was lined up to ban them, as was pretty much all of Europe. And we kind of looked at it and, smoking kills a lot of people. It's a behavioural issue. It's one of the only things which is a product which, if used correctly, will kill you, will kill the most users, right? But we were looking at it and the conclusion was, well, e-cigarettes, only at the time, have 3,000 less carcinogens in than a cigarette. And it turns out they're 60% more effective as a route to quitting smoking than the alternative. So we're like, this is really dumb. Why are we about to ban them? And so we did some work on it and we persuaded ministers that actually that was wrong. We should actually make them available in Britain. You can leave aside the arc of where you end up with teenagers having them. But that would be an example where we were looking at it and saying, it looks like government policy is in the wrong way. So we could do a mix of it. Yeah.
Could you ever turn the mirror onto government itself and say, well, we've got ideas about how you can work better?
Oh, yes, certainly. It turns out government is populated by human beings too, which have got the same so-called biases and errors of thought. We actually wrote a report a number of years ago called Behavioural Government, which was looking at this, about how governments themselves are prone to errors. To give you an everyday example, which is, in general, humans tend to be overconfident. Sorry to tell you this, Peter. You got your new business idea. You're like, oh, it's a great idea. Like, it's kind of good in some ways.
It's an affliction I've had my whole life.
Right. It's like, because it means that people will be heroic and try things like, that didn't work. But you kind of want them to do that. But you also see that in governments. Wouldn't it be a good idea? Look, let's go and invade this country. I'm sure we can figure it out and make it better afterwards. Like, it's plagued by overconfidence. And you also see that the more senior you become, the more prone you are to overconfidence. Right? So that's a human problem, but in government, it becomes a pretty major issue. So you can say, well, what are the kind of things you can do about that? You can't change humans overnight. You can do a bit. So you may know Tetlock work. We've done exercise where you what's called calibration. You test people how well they predict or are calibrated to future events. And it turns out you can give people feedback and you can get them better in predictions. But you can also use institutional design. So you can say an example would be a red team. You know what I mean by red teaming? And, so it's kind of US Army type thing.
Okay.
You got your great plan about how you're going to do this thing. Everybody's brilliant, super brilliant plan, Peter. So you run a simulation and you create look at that. Yeah, you create exactly, noticing, deliberating, executing. Subject to error in all those areas. So red team is you say, okay, red team, of course, you can guess who they are if you're US Army, who the Reds are. So you get a bunch of these people say, well, you try and, how would you counter our plan? And then, of course, maybe they do something, they go around the air, they do something else. Like, well, wait a minute, that's cheating. It's like, hey, it's warfare. We want to win, right? So it identifies holes or problems in your solution. So institutions are really bad at doing that, particularly you've got senior people. They're like, oh, that's a great idea, and people kind of agree and so on. So you want to create deliberate institutional mechanisms that create a license to say, hey, in fact, you'd be a perfect red teamer, probably, Peter. You bring them in to say, can you come up with all the things that is wrong with this? But guess what? You don't get to be employee of the month if you do that on a regular basis. Like, oh my God, Peter's always coming up with all the things that are wrong. But actually you want it. You want to create these moments and spaces institutionally where you say, can someone have a team literally come back and say all the reason why this policy is wrong and will fail? So these are examples where you try and understand human behavior, including in government itself, and you say, well, it's subject to these same problems. What would you do about it?
Do you think it's important for people to know, the public to widely know that something like the nudge unit exists, that they are being kind of, coerced is the wrong word, but they're not fully aware that they're being nudged towards making certain decisions?
Well, I think you should always be transparent about it. And, my colleagues in the US, like Richard Thaler, are very strongly that same view. I go back to the rumble strip. The rumble strip is a beautiful nudge on our roads. It's kind of there. You can see it. It still works. So yes, absolutely. Why wouldn't you just be open about those things? And I think a lot of people do know, it's very public, that the Behavioural Insights team, the nudge unit, existed, and now there are a lot of them across the world. So I think that is important. There are limits to it, which is that, if you think when you go into your supermarket, it is busy nudging you on 100 different fronts, right? Or if you go to a Vegas casino, it is nudging. And you could say, well, fine, I can go somewhere else.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Right?
I've been to Vegas.
But the point is, often their power still operates, even if you're kind of half aware of it. Or they operate because you're in a hurry and you just want to pick up the food and so on. You've got other things in your mind. They still operate and are effective. So I think, obviously, yes, you should be transparent about it. But that isn't actually enough, because even when you can see you're being nudged, it is still sometimes important, which is why I go back to this point about who shapes the shapers. That applies both in government, which is why, it shouldn't be for people like me, to just do whatever I think. Thank God you got a democratically elected government. They're the ones who are saying, can you prioritize or yes or no to these elements? It should also be true in many other domains of life. So who does get to shape those things which shape your behavior? Fine, you can avoid a Vegas casino, right? But it is a kind of masterpiece of behavioral science. Actually, you could have sort of admired it. Like, you isolate people from cues of the daylight. You have these giant rooms of machines that are all going ka-ching. Why do you do that? Why do you want the room as big as possible? Because you always want to hear someone who's winning, because it throws your estimates about the chance of it, right?
Yeah.
More sophisticated forms of it. Because if you're actually losing money, someone will come to you and say, look, Peter, it should be fun. Come and have a meal on us. Like, they want to get you just before you exit. It's kind of scarily clever. When you start putting that online in large volumes, that becomes, look at entanglement in sports. That becomes, well, are we still comfortable about it? Like, what's the point at which, when you're not paying attention, it's still effective? And did you get to choose it, right? So one of the things actually government should be doing its job is it should be acting on the behalf of the citizens to say, well, no, we're going to put some parameters around that. Can we nudge for good? You see what I mean? To help people make better choices for themselves, right? It's not to make the choices. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that takes me back to what I said earlier. If a government is using a nudge unit and it is effective, are there areas they start to want to push towards it which become unethical? And I don't even know if you'd answer this, but were you ever asked to do things you thought, hold on, we shouldn't be doing that?
There's some things we didn't do. We didn't do anything. There's only one ever project we ever did on related to voting behaviour, and it wasn't directly on voting. And you might say,
just get more people voting.
Well, it was literally about voter register. How are people registering, and and are there prompts you can do to get people to make sure they're on the electoral register? Which you might say a government asked us to do that, but they didn't ask us. But you can imagine lots of places they'd say, well, can you make them vote a certain way, right? There's obviously big political machines that do that. That was definitely not our business, right? And you say rightly so.
Well, it makes me think of the hanging chads back. So could it come down to actually design of the voting dockets, that people are more influenced to pick somebody based on the design? Like, where does when can democracy get broken in this? And is there a risk of that? Because even if your unit is fiercely independent, but the government could find another nudge unit to do specific projects, and
it could do. Or hey, look, political parties do this. And they do it at a massive volume in the US, right? How do you get the vote out? How do you get your voters out? There's, huge sums of money being spent. This in the US originally, for example, the Analytic Institute did lots of very detailed work on this, and lots of others do. And there are known literatures on that. For example, where you vote affects how you vote. There's some evidence, and take it with a pinch of salt, but there's some evidence that if you, when you go to actually place your vote, if you vote in a school, you're more likely to be slightly progressive. You're reminded of the state and, paying, et cetera, and those sorts of things for schools and so on. Whereas if you vote in a church where there's symbols of God and death, you're slightly more likely to vote to the right. That would be an example, right? Yeah. So you can imagine there's a world in which if you had a political party, you think, oh, definitely, can we all change? So hence you want things like the Electoral Commission. You might say, well, actually, it kind of evens out like in the US because both parties are using those things, but you think, well, there should be some limits on it, and we should at least be aware of it. Hence, who shapes the shapers once you become aware of them. So are there things you should or shouldn't do? I mean, look, that's where legitimate politics comes. I mean, a big area for a country like Britain, frankly, is we're all fat and unfit and whatever. And it's like, well, that's all our God-given right to choose and eat how much we want. Well, fine, but how much did you choose how much sugar was added to your kids' baby food, right? And one of the really deep issues, if we get beyond the kind of the obvious party politics, is what your preferences turns out to be a bit complicated. And we see that, for example, on social media too. So the classic thing is your revealed preference. What you are doing, Peter, well, that must be what you wanted. Like if you want to spend 3 hours a day on social media, well, that's what you wanted, right? And yet when you separate people from that, they say actually they're kind of a bit happier and they don't. So your expressed preference, in your moment by moment, particularly in a world of attentional capture, seems to be spend it forever scrolling, looking at cats falling over, whatever. And yet when you put a little bit of friction in, people then make different choices. So it's like, well, what do you want then, Peter? Which of you will the real Peter stand up? Is it like the moment by moment, or on reflection, what do you want for tomorrow or your kids? Turns out to be a different preference. Let alone if you get a group of people together, like the family, what do you want to do? Should we have a rule we don't have? Well, let's not have phones at the table. That'd be a micro example of it, right? So those preferences, you see what I mean? They're now inconsistent. So forget party politics. In your own head, you're not consistent.
No, that's true.
So that hits in a really interesting way, which is that, we have these biases and so on, and our own heads are quite complicated what's going on. Which is the one you want to have come to the fore? And why it matters is because a lot of the moment decisions are driven by what's called fast brain, right? Mm-hmm. The biases, someone's, oh, look at that, right? You didn't think about it carefully. Whereas those other ones are the kind of more reflective, what do you want to do? I mean, I don't know, my son says, he's got a good rule, I think it's a good one, which is whenever you pick up your phone, before you do it, think about what is it you wanted to do. Try and remember that for the 10 seconds. How often you pick it up, and then you've been faffing around for 20 minutes, you put it down, it's like, oh crap, I meant to look up the weather and I didn't do it, right? So there's a sense in which your brain has got hacked, right? So it comes back to the shaping the shapers. What is it you want to do, right? And these mechanisms. One of the things actually I'm working on at the moment, a book on, which is called Boost. How do you boost your capacity to be a better decision maker? So one of the criticisms you can make of this whole area is that, hey, Peter, we made you make better decisions. You're saving more for your pension, right? Whatever. We did the sugar levy. You got less sugar in your drinks. Fine. So we made a better decision in some ways for you, or helped you make a better decision, but we didn't make you a better decision maker. And so the next step is, which was talking about this thing about the economy, is the deeper argument is, can we boost your capacity to make the decision? Can we make you a better decision? Not to make your decision, make you a better decision maker. And that's the sort of real frontier behavioral science, you see what I mean, which goes beyond nudge into this sort of next layer.
Well, I think, I'm not the thinnest. I have a preference to be fat shamed than have a sugar tax, so I have less sugar. So I consciously made that decision. But the deeper point there is that if we soften everything too much, are we essentially softening people towards the world of Wall-E? I don't know if you remember that cartoon.
I do know that.
Rather than having a strong, resilient, child that becomes a young adult, becomes an adult who makes strong and tough decisions because they've been through hardship. If we soften everything too much by nudging, are we taking agency away?
Well, but that's why I think one of those next frontier areas, right, is that a lot of nudges are, you kind of create, like you set up the canteen in a healthy way. So, and it's not a crazy thing to do, because it's like, when you're not paying attention is the drift towards a healthy default, right? It's particularly powerful if you say, well, not for me, but the parents and the kids should decide, how do we want our canteen arranged? And so one of the useful things behavioral science does, it says, did you realize how much it changes your behavior as to which order you put it in? So for most people, it's something like, when you got a plate full and you come to canteen, you fill 2/3 of it by, say, the first 3 things you've reached. And then by, so it is consequential. And so your school council make the decision, right? So that would be an example. But this point beyond it is, yes, absolutely. How do you strengthen people's capacity to be better decision makers? That is both in terms of the individual. So a really nice thing, going to your point, is this beautiful work on, can you teach kids to be better bullshit detectors? Excuse my language, but it was cool. And it turns out you can, so you can teach kids, and in fact, adults too, which is whenever someone makes a claim, recognize it's a claim. You just made a claim that this thing is true about Bitcoin or whatever. Where was your evidence, Peter? What made you think that, right? You get people into habit of saying, well, what behind it? And then you get to assess, well, was that a good thing or just a taxi driver told you, right? So you can get people to be, that would be a way of strengthening your individual capacity to make better decisions. But the fact is, a lot of your decisions are driven because you're busy thinking about other things and the world is nudging you, often commercial players, and then you end up doing something which you didn't quite intend to do. So that's the other element of the boost side, which is creating an environment within which you can make a better choice. Okay, a simple example would be, you're going to go on holiday, you've got to decide what to do on your Forex or your exchange rates. There's a whole load of different ways of writing this, which obscure people's ability to make a comparison. Like, is a commission included? Is it not included? Like, it turns out people aren't very good at math. Shock horror. And companies will often use that to create some version of confusology.
Yeah.
And the depressing detail, I'm afraid, is confusology really works. So you come along as being a super honest company, but it might not work because the ones with the confusing adverts actually get the customers. So you're like, geez, well, what do you do with your business? You either carry on heroically, being straightforward, or you join the rest and then you got a chance. So sometimes businesses can collect together and say, look, this is not right, we'll reset it. But you can see why you can get into an equilibrium, which is often confusology. And again, there's some version of the we has to kick in, right? Like, we get together and say, this is stupid, can we make this clear? But that's one of the things we invented government to do. Can you make sure the labeling is fair and so we can make a proper comparison? That is also boosting your capacity. So we could boost your capacity by getting you to stay at school for an extra 5 years and learn more maths and do comparisons. Or we can design these things where you can tell the damn difference, right? That also boosts your capacity. So a lot of, this cutting edge stuff hits that area. Now, is your government doing that or not? You can argue about it, but someone's going to have to do that and make the world better, including helping people make better choices for themselves.
Yeah, I keep thinking back to this canteen, and I get it. It's a great idea. Yeah, if the salad's first, I'm going to get some salad. There's not going to be enough space. But unless everywhere's doing that, it can be just a one-off. And is it not better that I choose the salad naturally rather than just because I'm being nudged towards it? Then every time I start making decisions, I make good decisions in all locations rather than being nudged.
Look, it's obviously, I'm a big believer in human agency, right?
Yeah.
If it's a left or right thing, I don't know, but it's like, isn't that a good thing to believe in human agency? And so how do you support those choices? But you just got to realize that sometimes when markets hit human beings who are in a hurry and use shortcuts, that sometimes creates these so-called problematic equilibrium where the good business won't succeed, right? And so to some extent, the businesses have to come together and say, geez, would it be better in our supermarkets if we had a little bit more fresh fruit and a little bit less chocolate, right? But the problem is, whenever Peter and everyone else wanders in, they're like, oh, chocolate. But even if you'd asked Peter before, actually, for God's sake, would you not put all that chocolate there, right? So the market finds an equilibrium because that's what you want, your revealed preference. And yet if we ask you, and with other people, you say, for God's sake, can we have less chocolate? See what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get it.
The world turns out to have a lot of those things where, our human nature and evolution has taken us to a certain place. And it's particularly critical in an attentional economy where your attention is being stolen kind of below the radar because it's kind of got below your thought and then you've done something. So we need a bit of a helping hand. That's the point. And so that's why I go back again and again to shape the shapers. You need some mechanism, which sounds a lot like democracy, which is when do we get together and say, you know what, guys, I know I kind of prefer the food, which is a little bit sweeter, but could we just, if we all dial down the sugar a bit, I wouldn't notice the difference. This is true, right? And that would be better. And if at home I want to add more sugar, I can do it. But it's like, the problem is that the supermarket that tries to do all the stuff which isn't the extra sugar kind of gets, you know what I mean, because of how, it does taste a bit better. Do you know what I mean? So that's a problem we're in. And so, you know, so why it goes back to the point is, what do you want who is the real Peter, right? Is it Peter is the one that you just make, you're not paying attention, or is it Peter which is when I am paying attention, I make a different choice? So, and some of that is using that Peter to then shape the world around you actively.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about, unless there's anything I've missed you think I should have asked you, was it's about AI. How influential is AI becoming in this world? And are there any additional risks with that? And in that, look, I don't mind too much of these ideas. The one I worry about is the nudges towards social credit scores, being good citizens and punished and rewarded based on being a good citizen. Because I just think it's a really slippery slope.
Yeah.
I use AI a lot and I love it. It's funny you said earlier about, do you want the AI to remember? ChatGPT weirds me out sometimes with the way I ask it certain things, and I know it knows me because it's saying certain things to me about, like, I might ask it something to do with my podcast, or I might ask it something to do with a different podcast, but it reflects upon my podcast. Yeah. And it's super interesting that it remembers those things. I find AI fascinating and scary at the same time. But how much is it being used with this work, and are there any risks?
Well, I think obviously there are risks, and it's evolving pretty fast, and it's definitely, again, one of those sort of, are we aware of what it's doing and the choices and how it may be affecting us? To step back for a minute, I think one of the really interesting things is how our brains and our cultures are interlocked with technology in this interesting ways, in ways we often don't understand. You know, when fire gets invented, our brains get to grow bigger. When people started putting clocks in towns in medieval Europe, it changes literally how we think and how our economies operate. But they didn't think that's not why they did it, right? And so on. And AI almost certainly has got some of that aspects to it. It's changing us and our kids, and it's some kind of symbiotic relationship, which we don't fully understand. Is it being used in this area? Well, look, certainly earlier forms of it, we would otherwise call machine learning, is being used, and rightly, by the way, should be used in lots of areas, including by government to solve things. I mean, we did work back in 2016, for example, building a machine learning model to see, could you train it to identify bad doctors? Remember Shipman? You know, got all these inspectors. We showed that a machine learning model could do an amazingly good job to identify the very small numbers of bad doctors better than the inspectors, right?
Correct.
So that seems a good thing, right?
Yeah.
So stopping bads, we generally are pretty good at. Like, we like the state to do that, right? Stop the bad things. Where else does it go to? I mean, one of the key questions is, I said, it almost, we call the political economy about it, is it can clearly be a boost to help and support you in various kinds of ways. I mean, one of the remarks sometimes made is like incredible machine learning and increasingly AI to guide some of these choices about what you're going to watch next on TV or whatever, right? Or your next video, normally to capture attention for a particular reason. But wouldn't it be neat to advise kids about how to do their maths better, or career choices, right? Where's the AI to do these other things where it may be a less obvious immediate market gain, but would matter for life, or help us make better choices in life? You know, when you come to your menu, like, I wonder which are, you know, and then you regret your choice in a restaurant. What I mean, an AI said, actually, Peter, you know what, you keep ordering those shrimp, and you know what, you don't like him. I mean, otherwise that's what a partner is for, right? But, you know, but you have to say, so what's the economy behind it? So if I go back even to the sort of simple, you know, online searches, right, which have now are being potentially overtaken by AI, going back to that plumber, the AAA plumber, right? The underlying previous logic was actually, it's an efficient thing to do in the market is to get to the top of that list, because you're in a hurry, and like, you make that choice, you're not going to scroll very far because we're in a hurry. You're paying for it. So if getting to the top of the list is someone is paying for it, that's not the same as they're a good plumber.
Yeah.
in an ideal, you can imagine an AI, much more sophisticated, actually, it can see through that and say, actually, I will find you a good plumber, right? It could do that. And imagine how it can help in all kinds of areas. But once you've got that, there's enormous market value behind that thing to say, am I saying the best plumber or actually the one that's going to, those questions are going to come around again in all kinds of other dimensions when this thing is helping you. Is it helping for you to the best thing for you, or it's the best thing for someone else? You don't have to go very far. Look, everyday bits of our life. Your bank. I think the bank is a good example. Banks could, and they are umbling and ahhing about how much they could use AI, right? When you go to your bank and, can I borrow some money? Are they like the Vegas casino trying to work out what's the most expensive rate I can get you to take before you go somewhere else, right? Or are they working on your behalf to say, I'm going to go out to the market and find the best possible rate for you, Peter, and broker it in that way? But it's not just that. You can do it in lots of other areas, right? They could say, oh my God, Peter, you look how much you spend on your electricity. I can see your energy efficiency of your house because we know where you live, by the way, and we can look up your energy performance certificate and then we can see how much you're paying on electricity. This is mad. By the way, we'll lend you some money and here's a good builder. They could lean in and help your life. Are they doing it on your behalf, or who's making the profit from that, right? So the political economy that sits behind it, which goes to the sort of governance of it all. So it's got that duality, incredible power to be this incredible aid to help us make better choices in life, like the ultimate, right? But also it's like you've now given your agency away to something else. So
yeah, a little bit,
right?
I don't know. I mean, I use AI a lot daily, from everything from preparing for an interview to helping write program notes for my football team, to just double checking my spelling and grammar, which it is always infinitely better than I am.
Yeah.
And the idea of having an AI agent that works for me, it says, right, I need to renew my car insurance. I don't really want to phone them up because my current place, they're just going to add 5% to last year.
Yeah.
And then if I phone around, they're going to say to me, well, what's the best you've been offered today, and offer slightly less. And then I don't want to go onto the various websites because I know they inflate slightly. If an agent can just go out and do that work for me, great. I think that's additive.
Yep.
In some ways it's not been additive. It is dumbing me because I am outsourcing some of my writing now to AI, which I don't think is additive. A similar way that calculators have taken us away from calculating things. But fine, it is what it is.
Yep.
All that stuff, but I'm kind of okay with that. If it makes us a more productive, more efficient society, great. It's when you put these tools in the hands of people who've got incentives to use them nefariously. And if you look at my Instagram, you'll see I probably look at somebody who's very anti-government. My default position is I don't trust government.
Yep.
You earn your trust. And I often find, I could imagine a scenario where an AI could tell government they're doing something wrong and give them very good reasoning, but they ignore that because their incentive is to retain power. Yeah. Therefore, what are the risks of governments using AI nefariously? That's what I would worry about.
So I think you're right to worry about that. And you used a great phrase in there, and it's very similar to what Pippa Norris, who studies trust in governments across the world, looks at, right? Some version of skeptical trust is a good place to be. Reagan, trust and verify. So that's definitely true for government. It's true for anyone or any organization with power too, right? Which is big corporations can do that. And as said, particularly in a world where you've got attentional hacks as well running, you periodically want to step away from it and say, well, can I trust, on whose behalf is this working? So I think that's right and proper, which is why I'm pleased to live in a democratic country where we can get rid of our government and replace them, And by the way, I think one of the things you can do for some of the corporations is literally, we might say, you should have some of the same element. You can literally make governance interventions to say, do the customers actually get an input in some way, not just as consumers? And I think that's absolutely true for AI as it moves and evolves. I think it raises more profound other questions that you were alluding to around, well, what are we for? What's our comparative advantage? What do we spend time? And they hit us all the time. You mentioned maths as a great one, right? I have a brother who's 4 years older than me, and he learned on a slide rule. You guys would be like, you have to Google it, slide rule. What is it? In America, they call it a slip something, or I can't remember something else, but, like, what is this thing? They were used for hundreds of years, and a lot of people think they helped your thinking, whatever. Now we just think it's bizarre. Today people say, should you do long division? If you guys over there, did they do long division? I don't know.
I did. You did, didn't you? Yeah.
Now it's like, what's the point of long division? Like, it literally is a real live question. Like, does it matter? Maybe it doesn't matter. So what are the things in there? How do they change and affect your brain? And, what are the things we want to do? You were talking about earlier, does it matter that you have to be effortful and think about certain things? And that's part of it, either to be efficient, or the backstop is, what does it mean to be a good human being? Like, in the end, when machines can do everything better, what's left for us to do? I think the answer is probably some version of sophisticated consumption, right? Like, the AI still can't taste the wine or the beer for you, right? That's going to be part of your core experience. And so I think it'll come back to some of those things. But also, one of the things I've tried to stress a bit, to me, the most interesting thing about behavioral science, once you get people to pay their tax or get them back to work faster, I mean, it's neat to do those things or whatever, help us maybe be slimmer. But it makes us understand a bit more of who we are and the forces that are driving our behavior. And our brains are really good at fooling us, by the way. There's just so many things that people are shocked by. Like, when you open a page, you think you can see all the words on it. In fact, you can't at any given time. Your spotlight, if you're on a screen, you can make the rest all turn to crap and people don't notice it. A million things. I can't see the blind spot in your eyes. But this is also true. We make these choices which have these unintended effects. Like, I don't know, there's people who worried a few years ago about whether Alexa will make all our kids just rude, right? Because you don't have to say please and thank you, Well, we could design it to actually, if you're not polite to an AI, maybe it shouldn't answer your questions. Would that be a good or bad thing? It will affect our behavior over time. We can at least start to understand the arc of that and make it a conscious choice, as opposed to one which just happens to you, happens to us. And that's maybe one of the most important things. I know we need to get to a close, but one of the overlap areas for behavioral science is literally life satisfaction and happiness. And you might remember when the behavioral insights team was being set up in the coalition government, Cameron was also interested in happiness. Do you remember that? Happiness, well-being. Oh yeah, he was like, this thing about happiness. And a lot of people thought, you're mad, including number 10. But it turns out, one of the details is, we're often not that good at predicting or even remembering what made us happy as human beings. So these patterns of errors aren't not just like, should I eat that extra piece of pie? It's like, it's true actually in lots of other areas too. So we often make mispredictions, including in markets. So, hey, we're coming up to Christmas. People buy their kids lots of things, big things often. In terms of what increases your happiness for kids, often experiences would be a simple example. So buy your kids something. We're going to go to this concert together. We'll go to this rate. An experience will, in fact, often lead to more happiness and well-being for you and your kid. But people literally mispredict it, right? Which is very consequential in market.
Yeah.
So going back to AI, one of the interesting questions is, can it make us like wiser human beings to know ourselves better so we make better choices? And then actually markets would also respond in that way, right? In terms of how we live our lives, who we date, how we act towards other people, right? And you can see there's a world in which, whether we want or not, there could be a kind of coach. They're going to be sort of life coaches, right? Mm-hmm. Are they going to guide us to being wiser, better human beings in the way that we want to be, or what, right? So I think that's actually a pretty profound set of questions which we're going to all be wrestling with the next few years.
Fascinating stuff. Yeah, fascinating. Really enjoyed this. Thank you. I still will hold my position that I'm worried about nefarious governments using this, and I'm worried about the more Orwellian sides to it. But knowing it exists, I think, can help. At least maybe I'll see things and understand why things are maybe being framed at me.
So the only, let me just say
now, do you know what's going to happen now? Is I'm going to go into a cafe and I'm going to see the salad. Go, no, I'm not having fucking salad. I don't know why
I'm being manipulated.
Yeah, where's the pizza?
Yeah, well, one of the wonderful things about humans is how they respond. Like labels on, actually, literally as an example. A lot of people think they would work, but one of the things they do is that, particularly actually working class men, often choose, if I'm where I do it myself sometimes, I look for the one that's got the most calories per pound. Like, it's like, so it works both ways. But even if you don't care about the behavioral science, the bit which we touched on earlier, I would say, is that just getting government to be more empirical. Like, if you want it to do something, for God's sake, can we get it to do some of those bits properly rather than badly?
I agree with that.
And let's at least hold on to that.
Brilliant. Well, listen, Inside the Nudge Unit, fantastic, fascinating. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone, for listening.